העולמי בין שני המחנות, האחד בהובלת ארצות הברית ושותפותיה, והשני בהובלת סין ובתמיכה חלקית מצד רוסיה, הולך ומחריף ומעמיד את ישראל בצומת בין המעצמות. בגזרה הכלכלית, ארצות הברית לוחצת לצמצום קשרי המסחר עם סין, זאת לצד הקשרים שהתבססו עם המזרח. בסקר המכון נמצא שיותר ממחצית מהציבור סבר תבקש זאת. על ישראל להימנע מייצוא טכנולוגיה רגישה לסין.
to avoid exporting means of warfare to China. 21% thought that when Israel determines a policy, it should be considerate of U.S. interests. And many of them think that Israel could successfully contend with reducing U.S. support for Israel. At the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, there are pressures on Israel by Europe to send practical assistance, and this could harm its relations with Russia and its leeway in Syria. From the survey of the Institute, it turns out that most Israelis advocate a cautious approach, advocating non-intervention, and only 20% were for clear-cut Israeli support for Ukraine. And on top of all these, there is a clear-cut struggle examining Israel's intentions, trying to figure out where it's going. So, at the backdrop of all that, the upcoming panel would like to devote to the influence of the war in Russia, as 1 year has passed with Ofer Shelah, a senior researcher at the INSS, former Knesset member Arkady, former Israeli ambassador to Russia, also a senior researcher at the INSS. You are invited to the stage. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to make an introductory comment. Israel indeed is not grass, even though it does find itself sometimes eaten up by sheep and donkeys and rhinos. And we're going to talk, not in this short time frame, we won't be able to encompass all the issues that have to do with this global event. We'll try to address certain points that are critical to the Israeli understanding and the Israeli conduct under this situation. But let me first ask you, Arkady, if you could do what we usually don't like to do and give some kind of a projection. Spring is about to come. Spring is supposed to bring with it changes in the front as well as changes in the geopolitical situation. Hoping, there was this Russian hope that the winter will lead to diminish this European and Western support. So where are we going? It's not working. Can you hear me now? Yes, you can hear me. Well, undoubtedly, there are so many variables. It's very difficult to make projections. I'm going to try and do it. So just some news flashes about the comprehensive picture. The front right now, there are fierce battles at the Donetsk region in one place around the city of Bakhmut. And there are so many victims on both sides. And both armies continue to fight. These are very fierce battles. There is a smaller outbreak in the south near Zaporozhye. Right now, this is the situation. Now, as for predictions, there are two sides. There are major gaps, true abyss between both sides. The Ukrainians, after everything that happened in Buchach, they are no longer interested in speaking with the Russians. Zelensky said a few days ago quite clearly that, there's no one to speak with, and it's clear why he thinks so. On the Russian side, it's a completely different picture. Putin still thinks that he can, be saved from the war, and the military is concentrating its efforts at the Donetsk region, hoping that they'll be able to conquer it in a matter of weeks. But I highly doubt that this is possible. But he still believes in the power and might of Russia, and of course the nuclear weapons, which he keeps mentioning. Its existence will prevent a failure from him because he's so afraid of a failure, and it's quite obvious that he's only interested in victory. Both sides are definitely entrenching their positions, and there will definitely be some development in the spring. There will be fierce battles. Both sides are accumulating weapons, and this is what we can look forward to. I think that the first lesson, as we look at it, by the way, the INSS is in the process of publishing a book that will focus on the lessons Israel learns from the Russia-Ukraine war. And there are many things that can be said, even though it is far from ending the war. I think that one lesson, we cannot expand on it now. Be careful with your thoughts about a speedy end to a war, like Putin thought, and like those who planned this campaign promised him at the beginning, because you know these things, you always know how you start, you never know how it finishes. Another lesson, even for us here, I mean, we've developed a certain evaluation or admiration for Russia's use of hard power, and it worked for them in Georgia and in Crimea in 2014, and a certain fear that the democratic world simply doesn't know how to last. The democracies are weak, they're spoiled, they find it difficult to find uniformity in their attempt to form a coalition, and we can see a democratic front led by the US, of course, but also with European countries that are paying significant economic prices. And I highly doubt whether any one of us would have thought last year on February 24 that it would last over a year and survive two winters with energy issues and the rising prices, which of course join global economic other negative global economic trends. So in this respect, I think we can learn a lesson that democracies have a resilience that we don't always appreciate. Values have a standing capability we don't always appreciate, and dictatorships, they have a tendency to lie to themselves, to build worlds that don't necessarily last. And now I'd like to take the ball back into your park, Arkady. At least from my perspective, you cannot exactly say that Putin holds the support of the Russian people under an iron boot. And there's this narrative, and we can find some similarities to that in Israel, which always brings together nations under the narrative of we were attacked and we are now responding. Do you see such determination or any possibility to cracks in this determination on the Russian side? Let me add one more point about the Western countries. I think that the Western countries never believed that they could rally together in the way that they did, and NATO was about to also be dismantled. I think people thought there is no longer a need for that, and Putin didn't think it would last, and lo and behold, NATO just added Finland and Sweden and Ukraine de facto. So now all of a sudden the Russian border with NATO is miles long. So the Russians, they got what they got. Now, regarding resilience and national resilience, I think it's a basic point, the most important one. The Ukrainians came together. Everybody thought that Zelensky would explain that the Russians won't want to find it. Kids, 10, 12 years old, prepared Molotov cocktails when the Russians were in the outskirts of Kiev. And this is an image that this generation will remember for the rest of their lives. Future generations will live on these images. And the Ukrainian might, in the absence of advanced weapons and with the absence of an ability to deal with missiles and aircrafts, but national resilience had a major impact on this ability to rally. And the fact is that the Ukrainians had some victories that were inconceivable to the Russians. The tanks, some of them have arrived, only 4 or 5, but for the Ukrainians, it's a very important symbol. It's a symbol that they're moving forward now. Challenger tanks came and HIMARS, in large quantities, and all this creates, together with national resilience and convergence. It's true, women, the men sent the women outside, over 8 million Ukrainian women. There are a few men who left, mainly in the first days, but everybody stayed. For example, my cousin who lives in the Ukraine, he sent all the women, his wife, his daughter, out, and the grandchildren outside of Ukraine, and he stayed with his son. And there are a lot of Jews who do that, by the way. Look, there's another point here that Putin didn't think that he would do. He thought that the Ukrainians, and he published an article in the summer of 2021 as part of the narrative why he needs to conquer. He published an essay that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people with two countries, and this is why it's their right, it's their duty even to conquer the Ukraine. But then it turned out that this war actually led to the coming together of the Ukrainian people. For the first time since the breaking up of the Soviet Union, they feel united. There are a lot of ethnic Russians who are fighting with the Ukrainian army. There are Jews who fight. There are the Tatarians from Crimea who are fighting in the Ukraine, and they're all saying today, I am Ukrainian, of Jewish descent, of Russian descent, etc. The mayor of Kharkiv, which is the second largest city, he didn't even speak Ukrainian. He learned Ukrainian during the war and started being interviewed in Ukrainian. So for us, the cohesion of the people and what happens outside the museum, outside, this is proof that we need to think very hard how we can reinstate our cohesion. Otherwise, we won't be able to withstand. And that's a lesson to be learned. I'd like to pick up on what Arkady said. First of all, what we saw is exceptional leadership of Zelensky. The estimate was, and there were even statements from the West that even he wasn't certain if he would be able to last. But I think that above everything else, it means, first of all, a nation that is protecting its lands finds the powers that it's not sure that they even knew they had. And another thing is that people don't like, and when I say don't like, I'm putting it very mildly in this context, that others decide for them what to do or dictate to them. And the Russian reliance that, the Ukrainians of Russian descent will immediately join them. This is what part of the Russian war plan was based on, but that wasn't the case, and it is a lesson to everybody who's trying to dictate to others who they are. Anybody who tries to dictate to others what their fate will be, people rise, nations rise, and an ethos is created around these kind of things. Another special phenomenon that's special to this war, and we think it will characterize the conflicts of the 21st century, is unprecedented involvement and unprecedented impact of the private sector, whether it's Elon Musk, who is mobilizing in order to save the satellite communications in Ukraine, which the Russians wanted to topple, and cyber experts from all over the world are rallying to protect Ukraine from cyber attacks, and mainly the impact, because this is a war that's being waged through economic means, the tremendous impact of the private sector over the economic sanctions, because what IKEA or McDonald's or Volvo or Volkswagen are doing, and definitely the high-tech companies, has just as big an impact as what the decision makers in Washington and Beijing have decided. Yes, corporate responsibility. This is something new that we've encountered in this war, and they definitely, no way, and most large corporations have left and also exerted pressure that left after a while. It may be a few minor ones are still there that are trying to maintain their business in Russia, but these companies understood that this is a matter of values, and because of our complex situation, we need to realize that these companies could have the same thoughts here as well. This is a very important point. We didn't know that it exists, because this is actually the first war that showed us that there is this aspect we didn't expect even. Now, these companies, not only did they leave, they also impacted the military, the Russian military power. Let's say there are certain components that are part of advanced weapons. All the software and all the hardware were or are Western, and they stopped. So all of this equipment cannot be used because it's not manufactured anymore. Now, I'm not talking about the automotive companies that left. It's true that the Chinese cars, filled in the assembly lines and production lines, but the Western companies, they were so deeply part of the Russian economy that everybody feels that. And when IKEA left, people stood in lines for hours in order to buy the very last parts because they know that they won't be able to restock that. We're not there yet, but no, I'd like to say that Israel needs to take into account that in these contexts, on certain issues well known to all of us, it's closer to Russia than Ukraine in the Western perception. In the private sector, you can't negotiate with it, and when decisions are made there, it's like this collective moving in one direction, and we need to take that into account. Let me just make one last comment. Somebody commented earlier that when the big elephants are fighting, the grass gets trampled. Well, Israel isn't grass, as we've heard, but Israel behaved and perhaps still behaves as it faces this major global event, which will be one of the defining events of the 21st century with great impacts, as if they're trying to make grass voices. And we usually provide micro tactical reasons for that, like the Air Force's freedom to fly in Syria in the war between the wars. And I'm not underestimating that. But there are certain events in which a country's policy, definitely a country that views itself and should view itself as a force that's much greater than a small ant in the Middle East, that is looking for refuge, needs to take that into account and behave differently. We also deal with that. Arkady, if you have one final comment, we need to think carefully what we should do with Russia, especially at the backdrop of the military cooperation, which is increasing in huge steps, and of course between Russia and Iran. And we must think real hard what we're going to do. And of course, we at the INSS deal with this extensively, and we're also going to publish something about it that will try to describe this fully. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.